Modern life. Between careers, kids, and health, it can be mayhem. That's why we're here. I'm Dr. Lisa Varghese-Kroll.
And I'm Dr. Lonray Falusi. We're physicians, moms, and longtime friends who break it all down for you. Wondering how to juggle all the balls and still stay sane? Looking for advice but don't want to be overwhelmed?
Curious about how to make the most out of life for your family but enjoy it at the same time? You're in the right place. Welcome to Health and Home with the Hippocratic hosts.
Since the start of the pandemic, more and more families have considered packing it all up and moving abroad. Today, we have part 2 of our discussion with Jennifer Stevens from the blog Adventurous Appetite, an American international school teacher who did just that, and now she's lived all over the world. Wondering what healthcare is like in other countries? What are her tips for moving abroad with kids? And whether she'd ever move home? Keep listening to find out all that and more.
Hey everyone, if you haven't listened to episode 40 yet, part 1 of this discussion, we encourage you to do that now to learn more about Jennifer's story and her advice on finding jobs and building community in a foreign country. If you have listened to part 1 already, here we go with part 2.
So you alluded earlier to some health emergencies that have happened. Can you talk a little bit more about your experience with healthcare living in these different countries?
Yeah, sure. So I'll start, so I don't ramble on again. I'll start chronologically of where I've lived, just so I can keep it straight. So I first moved to Korea, as I said, and while I was there, I actually got hit by a motorcycle.
Oh my God.
Yeah. And so I broke my cheek, my nose, my hand, my ribs, and
Oh, wow.
yeah, it was scary, and I was unconscious, and so I woke up in the hospital, and I was on Valium or some sedative, so I didn't really know what was going on, and but I had some friends that were by my bedside, and my sister actually was in Korea for a bit of time as well, and she was over my bedside, and so I think one of the first questions I asked was about, being from the States, was, how did I get here? How much is this going to cost me?
Of course.
And it's like, not anything about your health, not, oh my gosh,
not at all.
right? It was,
Yeah.
I was unconscious, and am I
Right.
okay? It's,
Yeah.
and that's so
Far down the list.
Yeah, it's so sad that, as Americans,
is.
that's our first concern. And so, of course, the doctor's like, why are you thinking about that? And the ambulance was free. And I didn't actually pay for anything for that stay, because it was an accident that wasn't my fault. And the Korean government helped me.
Wow.
And that was a really, really positive experience, and really made me look at universal healthcare in a different way. And I also broke my ankle while I was in Korea, and that time it was my fault. I stepped into a hole, but a little clumsy. But it was the same. I got amazing care, and my director helped take me to the hospital for translation every week to take X-rays, just so they were making sure the bone was healing correctly.
Oh my God.
I know, really
That's unbelievable.
amazing. Honestly amazing. But it was so inexpensive. I don't remember. It was a while ago now. It was about 11 years ago. But I remember paying out of pocket. So, it was enough. It was little enough that I could pay in bills that I had in my wallet each time I went.
Wow.
That's amazing.
That's unbelievable.
And
important for us to hear.
Yeah, and the care was wonderful in Seoul. It was actually one of the first things I noticed when I first moved to that city was the amount of hospitals. I think at the time I made a joke like, wow, y'all have hospitals like we have Starbucks. They were just on every corner. So that was my experience in Korea, was really positive and really cutting edge. And then when I was in Colombia, I didn't need healthcare in the same way that I did in Korea, but each time I went, I had really great doctors. They all spoke English, and I felt like they really knew what they were talking about. And again, no issues with astronomical bills or payments. So really good experience there as well. And China is kind of an interesting experience because I often went to an expat facility that were run by doctors from English-speaking countries. So that's where I had most of my checkups done. But I did have to go to a state-run hospital because I had... this is going to be an overshare, but I couldn't stop vomiting for about 12 hours, and I was so dehydrated and weak that I had to just go to the nearest place. So my now husband walked me over, and it was a very different experience. There were a lot of people there, and I was hooked up to, they did take good care of me in the sense that I walked out of there much better than when I walked in. And it was very inexpensive. And I did get the medicine that I needed. But there were no real nurses there. And I saw a lot of elderly people in beds with their kids taking care of them. And, there wasn't soap in the bathrooms. And so there is that occurs in different countries around the world. And so I think it goes back to that idea of privilege. I've been an expat and I have had insurance through my schools. And so I have been able to go to top tier hospitals and doctors and not really think about that. So that was an eye-opening experience to think, what are some of these local hospitals like that I'm not seeing?
No, absolutely. I think, tiered care is a reality, and so I think that's eye-opening whenever you get to experience different tiers.
Exactly. And so that was my experience in China. And then here in Romania, it's getting better here, but Romania is consistently rated the worst healthcare in the EU. It's just underfunded. I will say, though, I have had to get regular blood work done because I recently had thyroid cancer. And so I've gotten scans here and blood work done, and it's been fantastic. Really, really quick. I'll get my blood work results the next day, maybe even the same day. And for a whole battery of tests, like if you're getting a physical, it usually costs me around $100 out of pocket, and then I get reimbursed. And the scan's the same. I got an MRI for a knee issue a couple months ago, and I spent I spent about 100 euros out of pocket without insurance for a major scan. So that is great here.
Easily 10 times more.
Yeah, exactly. So it does vary from country to country, but I think the same, consistent things that I've seen is it's a lot cheaper.
Sure.
Is the one consistent. And I have been fortunate to receive great care everywhere I've been.
Yeah, I mean, as physicians, we know that cheaper often translates into better access, which is really, really, really important to us in terms of our patient population. So we think that's important to highlight. Now, as a teacher, do you have any tips for people moving abroad with kids? Because as we said, a lot of people do want to move abroad because of the idea of providing this rich experience for their kids.
Yeah. I think something to, again, with that list is understanding what type of educational experience they want their kids to experience. So a lot of people opt to, go for a local experience, which can be great, especially if kids are wanting to learn the local language. Since I've worked at international schools, most of my friends with kids have been teachers at these international schools, and so their kids have been able to attend for free With that said, if you are not going to be an international teacher and you're moving abroad as a digital nomad, or you're just, like we said, dipping your toe in and kind of doing a bunch of different things, I think something really important to keep in mind is that a lot of these international private schools are very expensive. The tuition, there's no way that my parents or myself could ever afford enrolling in one of these private schools.
Okay.
So I do think it's important to keep that in mind. Many companies do offer that as a benefit. So when I was living in Shanghai, some of our students were Disney families. And and working for some of these really large corporations. And I do know that a lot of those businesses, one of the perks for, moving the entire family abroad was providing good education for their kids.
Interesting.
So that's kind of a complex issue. I think something really important to think about is education. And if you are moving somewhere, I think understanding the visa process as well, how long you're going to stay, and what you can do and what you can't do on those specific visas. So are you able to enroll your child in a local school under a digital nomad visa? Are there international schools that you are interested in that maybe you can afford or that your company will pay for? So I think schooling is probably the number one thing to think about. Also thinking about, is my kid the type of kid that can learn online? Because if that's the case, there are tons of opportunities popping up online to kind of cater your child's education depending on interest and what they think they're going to do. But I do realize the younger the kids are, the more challenging that is, and the less screen time you want for them. So I think that's a hard balance to strike.
Makes sense.
So I think that's the number one thing to think about is probably education. And then another thing, like I said before, just kind of making a list of what you want your kids to get out of this experience. And then also realizing that there is culture shock. And depending on where you're going and depending on what your child is like, they could have varying degrees of culture shock. And what does that look like? And do you have access to mental health care if your child is maybe struggling with anxiety or maybe having more trouble to adapt than you planned? It's different for everyone. I've seen kids that are super resilient and they have nothing but amazing things to say and they make friends really quickly. But, there are other kids that have a tough time and they miss their friends back home and they only want to speak English. And so I think it's really important to have realistic expectations. You know your kids best, and maybe talking about, I think also mentally preparing for that jump before you do it. So if you are able to have some, counseling sessions beforehand with a psychologist, that would be wonderful if you could prep and kind of have a plan for things that could come up, because then they'll feel empowered and they'll know that it's coming.
Yeah. So how long does it take, would you say, to adjust to living in a new country? And have you had a favorite in terms of your adjustment to a new place?
It really, for me, it's depended on my state of mind and and I think my age and also the country. So again, I think it just really depends on where you're at in life and what you're doing. And for example, when I moved to Korea, I was young, I was 28, and I had no idea what I was getting myself into. And so I just jumped straight in, feet first, head first, whatever you say. And I had a blast, and I never experienced culture shock, which I think is crazy. But I think I was just at a really good state of mind, and I needed that adventure in that stage of my life. And so what might stress me out now as an older person, I thrived. Like that was what gave me energy. back then were like,
Yeah.
I don't understand this menu and I love it, you know, or yeah, I mean, it sounds kind of silly, but I just
No, it makes sense.
No, it's impressive.
Yeah.
and I remember talking to, you know, my colleagues and being like, guys, we live in Korea, you know, so it was just, I was young and it was exciting. And yeah, so I didn't really experience culture shock there. I think really until I had that moment of panic at the hospital, you know, where you're like, oh my gosh, this is something serious. And so it really kind of depends on what comes your way as well. And a lot of times you don't know how systems work in different countries. So that can also add to the culture shock because you don't feel in control. But this sounds really weird, but I think the toughest time that I had was when I moved to Colombia. Even though it was the closest to my home, I'm from Florida, you know, it was an easy flight home. I think it's because my expectations were different. Because when I moved to Korea and when I moved to China, I knew it was going to be very different. And I knew that language was going to be a barrier. And I knew, you know, I just knew that it was going to be challenging in ways that I was prepared for. But when I moved to Bogota, you know, it was a 2.5-hour flight from Orlando. And so it seemed like, you know, I don't know, this sounds stupid, but in my mind, I was like, it's like moving just a little south of Miami, you know, it'll be familiar to me. And it wasn't. And I hadn't mentally prepared for that. So I hadn't mentally prepared for the exhaustion that comes with learning a second language and being immersed in it while you're also learning a new school and a new culture and making friends and doing all of the things that you do when you move to a new country. That was really hard for me. And, you know, I went through a bout of depression and anxiety because of it and started seeing a mental health counselor, a psychologist, and a psychiatrist when I was in Bogota. They were fabulous.
Oh, that's wonderful.
Yes. And so I was able to get that help. And then learning Spanish and making local friends was huge for me. And once I felt like I was part of the community, it became a lot better. But that first year was really tough for me. And I think it's because I just hadn't managed my expectations properly.
Right.
Yeah.
That's a really interesting point. It reminds me of my experience because I moved from Canada to the U.S. when I was 17. And I think a lot of people think that that's real. I mean, that's just next door, right? Like, even I also didn't necessarily think it would be that much of, I don't even know if culture shock is the right word, but there is some sort of shock to the system that does take months to years to adjust to. And I absolutely was not expecting it. And I think I think that's a really interesting and little known point to bring up, because people may think that moving to another English speaking country is not necessarily that big of a deal, when it really might be in ways that we can't envision until we do it.
For sure. Yeah, you bring up such a good point, because I love that your experience of moving from Canada to the States, because we do think, oh, those are our neighbors, you know, it's the same place.
Right.
But it's not, you know,
not at all.
Even just healthcare, even just one.
That's what I was just thinking. Yep.
Even just one aspect. I think anytime that you don't know how systems are, you know, there's such a comfort in knowing how things work.
Yes.
Especially the older that you get, especially when you are with kids, you know, it's important. It's important to know how things work. And when you don't, you can feel out of control. And as we all know, when you feel out of control, that's when the anxiety creeps in.
Right,
So,
right. It is a form of privilege to be able to navigate any system, for sure. And I think also when you have differences such as, you know, universal healthcare in one place versus another place that doesn't, that also is reflective of sort of the principles and philosophy of the population. So I think that too is where a lot of stress can come in, because if using universal healthcare as an example, if you don't grow up with it, you often don't believe that it's necessary. If you do grow up with it, or you have experienced it in a time of need, you may feel differently. So I think that then informs how you respond to a lot of different issues, social, political, relationship issues. So that may be where some of the stress of that change comes in. And you're right. I think to be prepared for it is really key in minimizing potential suffering, when you make that change.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, even if you just take healthcare, for example, you're like, well, I think something's wrong. What do I have to go to a primary care doctor first? Can I jump right in and go to a specialist? And it's just, it seems like such a simple thing, but when it comes to something as important as your health, it becomes stressful very quickly.
Very frightening. Absolutely.
Can completely change the decisions that you make about your health, right? Based on where you are.
Oh, yeah.
And the question of primary care versus a specialist, I think some people are even thinking, do I go to anyone, or do I just sort of wait and let it become a crisis and then I'll be able to deal with it?
Well, yeah.
I can afford the prevention, but, just kind of hold off and hope that things go away, or just take care of it when it becomes an immediate problem. It's really tough.
It is, because you start thinking, because especially in terms of crisis, if we think something's wrong, even just one little obstacle can seem like too much.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Sure.
So even if you don't have like a recommendation, or, back home, I have a doctor I've seen since I was a child, and it brings me comfort. And so it's like, well, I don't want to see a new person. And what if they don't understand my background? And what if I can't get that information that they need? And then it just feels like too much. And then, like you said, you wait, and then worse things can happen, because you weren't diligent. And then, it's tricky.
Right. Because sometimes it's a choice that, am I going to see a doctor, or am I going to pay my rent? Right. Like these are impossible choices. Or are my kids going to eat? So it's, we're not judging at all. We totally understand. These are really tough things. But, you have said that Romania, maybe the healthcare system, you said was not rated highly in the EU. And I think you've said also that you would spend a total of 5 years in Romania. You talked a little bit about this earlier. So you guys are thinking about moving on. You mentioned Croatia and Mexico. Have you thought about any other places that you might be starting next year?
Yeah. I'll go back to the top of the episode where I talked about Diane Lane and Under the Tuscan Sun, because it's still very much a dream of mine to own a villa in Tuscany or wherever.
Yeah. Okay, we will definitely visit you. Just let us know when. We can house sit.
Right. No problem. Yeah. So my husband and I actually have been looking for houses in northern Italy.
Oh, fantastic.
It does seem like, and it is an immense privilege, and I am trying to live that Under the Tuscan love fantasy, but it's for different reasons than someone might think. Like, it's, the food is amazing, and who doesn't want to learn Italian, and, all the things that come with living in Italy.
Right.
But it's also so much more affordable. I can't even think about renting somewhere in Florida. I can't. The amount of money that my friends are paying for property right now, I mean, it's just prohibitive. And so for the same exact property with land, with vines or what have you, I'll just give you an example. We were looking at, and it was an old farmhouse. It needed restoration, but it was a pretty large 3-4 bedroom house, and it had property with fruit trees and wine grapes. And it was going to cost us 170,000 euros.
Oh my God. A day?
Right. Yeah. A month.
I mean, put a one in front of that number and you've got DC. Yeah.
Right.
Maybe a couple of ones actually in front of that number.
Right. I used to live in DC actually as well. And
oh, really?
Yeah.
Really?
Okay. That's where we are.
Oh, okay.
Yep. That's where our money goes.
Yeah, say no more. I get it. So that number, yeah. Are you talking about per year, or what are you actually talking about right now? So Italy is still, we actually made an offer on that house, and it fell through because we're learning a lot of information about mortgages, and there's a learning curve of how to work that out when you're not residents. So we're kind of just looking into what is going to make sense for our family, because my husband Luke's family still lives in Australia, mine still lives in Florida, and now we have friends all around the world that are like family to us.
I bet, yeah.
So we're like, where is somewhere central that people actually want to go to? Right. And then we're like, who doesn't want to go to Italy? Yeah. So
good call.
Yeah, so that's an option. And like we said, Croatia's offering the digital nomad visa. We've also looked into Portugal, but we're keeping things open. We do have the dog, so that's a concern of he's too big to fly in cabin. So we're also thinking, where can we go that we can drive our car? And then if we do go back, can we go back during a time that is a little bit more, temperate? Because, I don't know, I worry about the dog on the tarmac.
So you mentioned before, and just now around how the cost of moving back to the U.S. is pretty prohibitive. Can you talk a little bit more about maybe if you do ever see yourself coming back home and what might bring you back home?
Yeah, there have been periods of time where I have wanted to move back home. My parents, knock on wood, God forbid, they're very healthy. They're 72, but they walk every day, they work out. They're probably healthier than I am, to be honest. And they are very supportive of this lifestyle. But my sister is about to have a second child, and things happen where you think, should I move home now so that I can enjoy my parents, where they are at a time in their life where they're thriving, but they're still retired. And I want to be there for my nieces and nephews to grow up. And so these types of conversations always make me think maybe I should move home. But then when I sit down and actually do the math and weigh the pros and cons, I don't do it. And I just think it's a really complicated decision. And the longer that I live abroad, the tougher it becomes, because that concept of home is so gray now.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Because I have a partner from Australia, and so we're already an international family to start with. And, now this is my fourth international home. We're about to choose a fifth. And so where is home? My family lives in Florida, but when I think about what home is, I get homesick for different places I've lived. I get homesick for the fruit juices in Colombia, and I get homesick for, the noodles in China, or even just the friends that you make or the things that you do day to day. I used to pass every day in Shanghai these locals dancing ballroom dancing in the parks. And I get nostalgic for those things that you didn't know existed before you moved to these places. So that concept of home becomes so almost metaphorical. Like, it's just difficult to define. And so I don't know, it becomes... Every year it becomes harder and harder to envision myself back home, because you do change in ways that you're not even aware of until you go back. And so I think, will I even fit in anymore? Will that feel like home? So it's complicated.
Yeah, it is. It's definitely not an easy decision to make, right? Between family and finances and things that are even less tangible, that point that you made of where is home?
Yeah, exactly.
Right, because it's home Florida, it's home Australia, it's home somewhere where you had, transformative changes in your life and you feel still rooted there. It's tough.
Right.
And I think good for us to know, I mean, for anybody contemplating this kind of decision, I think it's good to know all the sort of the pros and cons, the good and bad, because the better prepared you are, the better experience it'll be.
And it's not all flowy skirts and pasta and wine.
Yeah, that makes it easier, right?
Right.
That makes it a lot easier, I'm sure. Yeah.
But still mostly flowy skirts and pasta.
Yeah.
I think, this is still sounding amazing.
It is. And, I did talk a lot about logistical things or things that I guess I would have wanted to think more about before I moved abroad. But the truth is, a lot of it has been magical, and it's been the best decision I've ever made in my entire life. And I would never take it back. I wouldn't even take back some of the most challenging days that I've had because of the things we talked about. Because at the end of the day, I understand the world in a way that I never would have, even if I had just traveled. Living somewhere versus traveling is a completely different experience. And what it teaches you, you could never find in a book, or it just changes you in ways that it's hard to verbalize. It's hard for me to tell you, but it's led me to love. It's led me to the person that I'm actually proud of, and it's given me perspective that I never would have had. And then, yes, I have had those moments where I've twirled around in a flowy skirt and drank wine. And, it's also led me to career paths I didn't even know existed. When I was in Shanghai, I was a food tour guide. And
oh my gosh.
And
dream.
And I was a food writer. I'd go to restaurants and review them, and I just don't think I'd have a lot of those opportunities if I had stayed at home, because things come your way because you're an English speaker and you're in an expat bubble, or, I've been on commercials because they're like, oh, we need an English speaker. Can you do it? I'm like, I guess. So it's funny what comes your way. And yeah.
Okay, you've twisted our arm, Jennifer. We're going in with you on the Italian villa.
Great,
okay, we will send you our info.
Then I don't even need the mortgage. We can just split it 3 ways.
I have $5.
Apparently, that's all you need.
Right, exactly. That buys the East Wing.
Exactly.
But thank you so much, Jennifer. This has been so enlightening, and we really hope that it's been helpful to listeners that might be considering this, might be cracking open that door in their mind. We're really grateful that you've shared your vast and really unique experience with us, and we wish you all the best. We're going to be following your blog, and we will be linking to your blog in our show notes at hippocratichost.com so that everyone else can follow along and see what country number 5 ends up being. Lucky country number 5.
Yeah.
Great. Thank you so much for having me. This was a really fun conversation.
Thank you so much.
Thanks so much to Jennifer Stevens for joining us and sharing her success story about moving abroad multiple times. For more on her life, check out her blog at adventurousappetite.com. And if you're thinking about whether a new country might be right for you, check out our show notes at hippocratichost.com for resources that can help. Thanks as always for listening. We appreciate you all so much. Please follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. We're also on Pinterest. If you like what you hear, please subscribe and review us in Apple Podcasts, and tell a friend about the show. Thanks, everyone. Talk to you again soon.
Thanks for listening to Health at Home with the Hippocratic hosts. Remember that all views expressed here are our own, not our employers, and all content is for informational purposes only and should not be construed as medical advice, nor the establishment of a doctor-patient relationship. Always consult your own physician or healthcare team for any medical issues.
If you enjoyed this episode, please rate us, subscribe, and tell a friend. And check out our website at www.hippocratichosts.com for show notes on this and all our episodes. Can't wait to chat with you next time.